So let's take a look at how automaticity can influence our perception and social judgment. And let's do that by consulting a study called The Role of Category Accessibility in the Interpretation of Information About Persons, Some Determinants and Implications. And of course, the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at the design. Here in the study, participants were faced with a scrambled sentence as task. So they were given sentences and were supposed to put them in, that were scrambled, and were supposed to put them into a regular, like a logical order. And participants faced either 30 or 60 sentences, and either they were in a condition where 20% or 80% of the sentences that they worked with were hostility related. What do I mean by hostility related? There would have been items like arm, she, broken leg. I guess that doesn't really make a sentence. I guess it would be a she broken leg. Then broken also doesn't make sense. So a she broke leg, perhaps. Then we could unscramble this to make she broke a leg. And filler items would be more innocent ones, such as found, I knew her. That could be I knew her, or I found her. Okay. All right, so these were the scrambled sentences that were supposed to be brought into a logical order. And after working through these 30 or 60 sentences, participants read a story, an ambiguous story, and they were supposed to rate the hostility of the person that was the main character in the story. So in the story, for instance, it's quite a famous example, the My Old Friend Donald story. And the story went like this. It goes, I went to visit my old friend Donald. Soon after I arrived, a salesman knocked at the door, but Donald refused to let him enter. He also told me that he was refusing to pay his rent until the landlord repaints his apartment. So this is an ambiguous story. You could construe the behavior of Donald as rather hostile, right? Because he's basically holding the landlord's money hostage, and he's refusing to open the door. But on the other hand, maybe if you wanted to interpret this in a less hostile way, you could say, well, this is just what he has to do in order to get his apartment repainted, and who knows what else the landlord has done so that Donald doesn't want to talk to him or her. Right, and these ambiguous stories, participants read and then rated the hostility of Donald in this case, either immediately or 1 hour later or 1 day later after reading these primes and working through these primes. And there were also two versions of the Donald story, so version A and version B, that were pretty similar, but not quite the same. Okay. So, this seems pretty complicated, right? And that's why I'd like you to pause this video here and just think for a minute what kind of a design this makes. So what are the factors? Do you think they're within or between? And then, therefore, what kind of a design is this? Take a moment to pause and then come back here when you have the answer to what kind of a design this study is. Now, if you're back, I'm going to unravel what kind of a design this would be. It would be, first of all, two items, either 30 or 60, the number of items, and that's a between subjects factor. And then, again, times 2 hostility content, either 20% or 80%, again, between. And then we have times 3, the time of rating, and this was within subjects. So participants rated the story right after, 1 hour after, and 1 day after they read it. We have, again, times 2, the story version, A versus B. So that makes a 2 by 2 by 3 by 2 mixed design. Okay, so if we look at the results of this actually quite complicated design, here is what we see, and you can see that there is no story version A versus B in this plot. Apparently the data was just collapsed over that, but we see on the x-axis the delay. So when did the hostility rating occur? The hostility rating is our dependent variable. So either it was right away, no delay, 1 hour delay, or 24 hours delay. And then on the y-axis, our dependent variable, the mean hostility rating of the target, here on a scale of 0 to 10. So it's an 11-point scale. And we see, first of all, the 60 items scrambled sentences are the lines displayed that have filled black dots, and the 30-item versions are the non-filled white dots. And then we have the 80% hostile primes. Those are the ones that are displayed by lines that are not dashed, just regular lines. And then we have the dashed lines for the 20% hostile primes. So what do we see? We see, first of all, that the more hostile primes there are, so in the 80% hostile primes conditions, both regarding the 60 and the 30 items, the hostility ratings are higher and higher consistently throughout all 3 points of measurement, compared to the 20% hostile primes that we see with the dashed lines again for both the 60 and 30 items. They are consistently lower over time than the 80% hostile items. So that seems like an interesting finding, right? It seems like if you prime people with the concept of hostility, it influences how they perceive a person, and this influence stays there for quite a while. It's there immediately, but it's also still there after an hour. And because we don't have error bars, it becomes hard to say if this is still significant after 24 hours. The difference between the 80% and the 20% hostile primes in terms of the mean hostility ratings. So that's difficult to say from this plot at least, but we could be more confident in saying that the 80 versus 20 seems significantly different right after the priming and 1 hour in. So that is the result of this study, the idea that we can prime people to perceive others as more or less hostile when they're faced with an ambiguous story. But, okay, so this is not all there is to this experiment, because other researchers try to rerun the same experiment, and that's what we would call a replication. So they rerun this experiment a number of times, and what I'm showing you here is what we call a forest plot, and it contains all the information about these attempts to replicate the study, to run it again and see if other people can find the same result. What you can see is in the first line that I marked with a purple box around it, this is the result from the study I just discussed with you, from the original 1979 piece of research. And there you can see that the mean difference in the hostility rating between the 80% hostile condition and the 20% hostile condition, right, what we've just discussed, you can see this represented by this little triangle. And if we translate it into an effect size, it gives us an effect size of 3.01. So that means on our 11-point scale, whether you are in the 20% hostile condition or in the 80% hostile condition, makes a difference in your hostility rating of 3 points. Okay, that's what the original study showed us. Now, below this are studies that were run again with the same materials that try to show the same effect, right? And you can see in this list, usually the name that's listed on the left is the name of the lead principal investigator who tried to collect data for that study. And we have some other information about all these experiments as well. So we have information, for instance, about the sample size for the 20% and the 80% hostile primes conditions, right? So if you take again a look at the first line, the one with the original experiment, the one that's framed in purple, you can see that in the 20% hostile condition, this experiment had 8 participants, and in the 80% hostile condition, again 8 participants. Now, if you paid attention in statistics class, you would know that this is not a lot. That's not a lot of participants, and in order to be able to have a test that has high power, that means if there is an effect out there, if this effect of influencing hostility judgments through the primes that people are presented with, if it truly exists and we want to find it, we should go at it with a lot of power in our test. That means we need a lot of subjects. And that's why the other studies that you see listed below had a much higher sample size, right? So they ran this with, in the first lab, Burt et al., they had 102 subjects in the 20% hostile condition, and 103 subjects in the 80% house-diet condition. And you can see this listed for the other labs as well. What you can also see is the mean ratings of participants given in the house-diet conditions that are 20 or 80%, and those would be the ratings for hostility of Donald in this case. And now we could look at all of these effects individually. So if we look at the mean difference, this is the little dots that are drawn in with the whiskers around them. You can see that they fluctuate around 0. Right? So there are some labs, for instance, BERT, they find an effect that is from the dotted line, which expresses a mean difference of 0. Because the effect, this tiny thing that is drawn on there, is a bit to the right, and the whisker around it is a 95% confidence interval. Right? And it doesn't include 0, so that means BERT et al., they found a positive effect. They found the effect that we were looking for in this study. But there are other labs, for instance, the lab of Roots. If you look at that, you can see that the little black dot for the mean difference between the 20 and 80% hostility conditions in terms of the hostility ratings is right on the dotted line. And the whiskers are to both sides of this line, so that's an effect that's 0. And there's also one lab, actually 2 labs, if you look all the way on the bottom, for instance, the Pennington lab, they found a negative effect. So the little dot is to the left of the dotted line, the 0 effect line, and the confidence interval does not include 0, so it's a significant effect, and it's smaller than 0. So they actually found the opposite from the original result. They didn't find that Donald was judged to be more hostile in the 80% hostility priming condition, but in the 20% hostility priming condition. So that would be quite the opposite of what the original study found. Now, instead of comparing each individual study to the original, each individual replication to the original study, what we could also do is look at the meta-analytic average. So basically, we run a procedure that takes together all this evidence from the replication studies and takes a look at whether it is significantly different from 0 if we take all the evidence together. And that is the line all the way in the bottom in this plot, again, with the purple frame. And here, what you can see is that is this diamond-shaped symbol. And this diamond, you have to really squint and look very closely. But you can also see the effect size on the right written down next to it. So the effect size is 0.08. And the confidence interval, that's again to the right of it, 95% confidence interval, is 0.004 to 0.16. So it just doesn't encapsulate 0. That means we have a significant effect, but this significant effect over all the replication studies, it's tiny. So it exists, but it's much, much smaller than the effect that was originally shown in the by the original authors. So that would be the one that's all the way in the top in the purple frame. That was 3 points difference, right, between the 80% and the 20% hostility ratings. But in the meta-analytic average of the replication studies, we find 0.08 points difference in hostility rating between the 2 priming conditions. So that means you would regularly need huge sample sizes in order to be able to actually obtain this effect. If you do, it seems like it does exist, but it's a tiny effect. So this puts into perspective a little bit the result that I've shown you before, where it looked like, oh my God, you can produce a huge difference in how people assess a person depending on the priming. But this replication effort here shows us that, yes, you can produce a difference in how people assess someone because of priming, but this difference is going to be small.